the great conservative movement of America and of our time. A brush fire of freedom is being lit all over this country. We, as an irate, tireless American populace, will overcome the few radical leftists that control the levers of power today. Joe Biden's failed economic policies has given us inflation like you can't believe, and the border is in disarray.
It's amazing how few of the people commenting on this have actually bothered to go see what's happening. Well, Congressman Andy Biggs of Arizona actually went to the border.
Biggs, where's Andy? Boy, oh boy, Andy. There's a guy. He's tough.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of What's the Big's Idea. I am pleased that you would take time out to join us. I want to read a letter to start with, just a portion of a letter that we sent to the acting director, Gary Restaino, who's the acting director of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. That was sent all about 4 months ago by myself and 26 members of Congress. And it goes like this. Dear Acting Director Restaino, at the aggressive direction of the Department of Justice, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives is currently undertaking a broad and unprecedented effort to revoke federal firearm licensees from law-abiding business owners throughout the country. In recent months, the number of FFL revocation proceedings initiated by ATF has skyrocketed, in fact, by 500%. That is an interesting issue that we're going to be talking about today, but it's reflective of the policies of this administration. Paul, the video, please.
So to gun owners out there who say, well, a Biden administration means they're going to come for my guns.
Bingo.
In time, hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15, your AK-47.
You also become known for your position on guns, and you're one of the very few Democrats, I think, who's been honest about that. You say that the U.S. government ought to ban a certain species of rifle. You wrote a piece about this. This is not a secret view you have. You wrote it in USA Today, and you say this: we should ban possession of military-style semi-automatic assault weapons. We should buy back such weapons from all who choose to abide by the law, and we should criminally prosecute any who choose to defy it by keeping their weapons. So we should confiscate.
Wow, just a little bit of a start here today. I am so pleased to have with me today Ashley Hlebinsky.
You got it right.
Ashley is really one of the foremost experts on firearms in the country. She is president of the Gun Code LLC, co-founder of University of Wyoming College of Law's Firearms Research Center, senior consulting firearms specialist with Cowan's Auctions, consulting curator of the LA Police Museum. And I got to know Ashley just a titch because I happened to be at sitting in the audience when she was on a panel, and I was so impressed with what she had to say, her knowledge, her information, that I said, I would love to have her on a podcast. And so just if you want to follow her on social media, you can go to Instagram at History in Heels, Facebook at official Ashley Hlebinsky, and Twitter at Ashley Hlebinsky. And the way you spell that is Hlebinsky.
Yeah, Ashley, but I have to tell you, I'm not actually on my Twitter. I just have it there.
Fair enough. Hey, look, Ashley, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
You really are one of the nation's foremost experts on firearms, and how you got there is kind of unorthodox compared to a lot of other folks that I talk to. So I wanted to just say, can you tell us a little bit how you developed this expertise, how you got to where you are?
Yeah. So as you said, it's not super normal. A lot of times when people find out what I do, they assume that I grew up around firearms, and I did not. I am from Western Pennsylvania, so that kind of also, I think, reinforces the stereotype a little bit. But it just wasn't a part of my family's culture growing up. Nothing good or bad about it, but just my dad's hobby was golf, and my mom was a teacher, a professional figure skater. So, different pastimes, right?
Wow.
And then I spent most of my childhood having a lot of different orthopedic surgeries. So I actually wanted to be a doctor. And I spent all of high school shadowing surgeons in and out of the OR, volunteering at an ER, basically anything I could do to get a leg up on, going to undergraduate and then ultimately medical school. And I was always interested in the history of medicine. And that's kind of what got me into where I am today, which is because I guess I just never really quite realized that people worked at historic sites and museums. I would go to them all the time as a kid, but I never really thought about that as a profession. And so I went to Gettysburg, which is about 3 hours from where I'm from. And they talked about how the advancements of weapons technology, specifically ammunition technology from the Civil War, how that changed medical technology on the battlefield. And I was like, well, it's kind of interesting. So I kind of started studying it a little bit, went to Colonial Williamsburg, kind of heard a similar spiel, but different technology. And I was like, all right, this is something I want to study. And so I switched my major to history in my freshman year. And my mother was not thrilled. A lot of history majors don't have a great reputation for working in the actual historical field. And so all she told me was I better have a job when I graduate. And so after that, I got an internship at a military museum where basically they put like 200 guns starting in the Civil War, going up through modern day in front of me. And I had to identify what they were, what had been modified about them, basically all of that museum cataloging information. And I knew nothing about guns, like other than like, okay, a, conically shaped projectile, causes this type of injury, like I didn't really know anything about it. And so I got a very quick lesson in firearms. And then from there, I decided that's what I wanted to study. And I learned to shoot historic and modern guns and ended up at the Smithsonian for a little bit and then was out at Cody for a decade. So it's a weird path, but I like that path because I think it helps me communicate with a wider population of people about firearms history.
That is so fascinating to hear how you arrived where you're at. Any advice for anybody else who wishes to emulate you somehow?
Good luck. It's terrible. Sorry. Actually, that's one of the things that I talk about a lot is the fact that in the United States, there really isn't a great platform. So like if you want to go and study firearms history or firearms material culture or whatever within the discipline, it's very, very difficult. In Europe, there are actually geared programs towards studying different levels of arms and armor history, firearms. So I say it's kind of ironic because in the United States, we've got this gun culture. But in Europe, where it's vastly different, there's fewer hangups on the actual study of firearms history. And so if you want to get into the field right now, you kind of have to create your own path. So a lot of universities will have like an American history program. And then, as you get beyond your beginning classes, you can find a professor, do independent studies, that kind of thing. And that's kind of how I got into it. And then I went straight to grad school. And like I said, too, they kind of have generic history and you just kind of have to, find your right professor, your right area and focus in that. I'm hoping that the University of Wyoming eventually will have, coursework in programming, but we just started this fall. So I don't want to get anyone's hopes up too soon.
Yeah, I mean, but it's a fascinating route you have taken, and it sounds like a fascinating area of study. And so good luck with setting up a program there.
We're hoping.
Yeah. As you testified before the U.S. Senate, I believe, the subcommittee on the Constitution at the Committee of Judiciary Committee. And the topic was Stop Gun Violence, Ghost Guns. And I don't think most people have ever really heard the term ghost guns. And so can you explain to the audience what a ghost gun is and what is the significance of ghost guns?
Oh, you're putting me on the spot. I don't know. I feel like a lot of people at this point have probably heard the term ghost gun, but they don't necessarily know what it is. When I testified in front of the Senate, I was basically there to provide. I always say I'm like the most boring person that you invite. You know, I'm the one that comes in with my like history and all of that. But basically, I was asked to come and speak about the history of privately made firearms in the United States, and then also right around the time I testified, the ATF had kind of released their first draft of a revision to the definition of firearm, receiver, all of that. So I actually made a direct response to that ATF draft, which nobody asked me to, but it felt relevant. So I did do that. And so the one thing that I pointed out to the subcommittee that was there and that I talk about all the time is that a lot of times there are terms that are used that are more for marketing than they are to actually describe what a particular functioning firearm is. So one that I've worked on a lot, I know we're talking about ghost guns, I'll get there, I promise, is, the term assault weapon. So I've worked on I worked on the California case as an expert. In running the Cody Firearms Museum, I rebuilt the museum with my team and we wrote content for 700 years worth of history. So I got really good at knowing definitions and what things mean and what they don't mean. And so you hear something like ghost gun, something like assault weapon, and that makes you think you understand what it is. But in reality, a lot of the times these terms are used to create a false sense of authority. So when you hear assault weapon, you automatically assume you know what it means. When you hear ghost gun, you have to assume that it has some level of concealability or, ability to, not be seen, and so these terms are chosen and quite smartly because it does make a lot of people be like, oh, I know what this means. And I think then these are what we should do to prevent them, keep them, whatever. And so to me, the term ghost gun is just an extenuation of that, kind of digestible marketing term that we can throw out to everybody so that we have a talking point. But the problem that I have with that is that when you kind of reduce it to that term, that talking point, that rhetorical point, it doesn't allow people who are trying to understand kind of the current state of affairs, the current laws, from really knowing what is being regulated, what is not being regulated. And when you talk about the quote unquote ghost gun, there are various definitions of it, but it usually falls under the purview of, a privately made firearm, but then the ghost component of it goes into, and this is kind of beyond my purview, but the parts kits and the 80% versus the 20% and all of that. But when
Ashley, when you say 80 to 20, you're talking about I think registered versus unregistered components or something like that, right?
What basically what you're able to produce inside the home and then also on transference. Although, like I said, I'm a historian, so I get a little foggy on all of those particular, where I don't know where they're at right now with it. But when you talk about that and ghost guns and privately made firearms and all of that, you are talking about a specific procedure that is done in the house, and then the conversation then goes into transfer and selling it, all of that, which is incredibly complicated as well.
Yeah, yeah, it does. So, I appreciate what you said because one way, from my point of view, when I hear the term assault weapon or ghost gun, I always say, well, that is a politically inflammatory description designed to characterize something or mischaracterize something in order to obtain a political end, if you follow what I'm saying.
Yeah. And one of the things that I said in front of the Senate and what I've said to a lot of different people is because I'm a historian, I don't take a side politically. I work with people across the spectrum on my job is to provide a historical foundation for people to make their own decisions. So it's not my job to tell you what to think about that. It's my job to provide you with more information, and then you can kind of go where you will with that. And the one thing that I said to the Senate is that, if the goal is to reduce violence, or if we are trying to kind of create ultimately the goal for everyone is to reduce, firearms related deaths. And if that is the goal, then don't you want to go into creating legislation or go into conversations having the best knowledge possible, the most information possible in order to help you formulate that decision. And so sometimes I just feel like the terms that we use almost obfuscate what it is we're trying to do. And, I have to say, like, the assault weapons thing is the thing that I tend to go back to more often, because when you actually look at the regulation of what is being kind of restricted in various states, its features, its specific types of firearms, yet the overall firearm, the semi-automatic, the center fire, those types of terms, those things are not actually banned. It's just features of those things are regulated, and that's different per state. And so when you look at that, you go, oh, look, we banned assault weapons. But then when you actually read the fine print, you realize that nothing was ultimately banned. And so then how can we truly measure the efficacy of a law if the law is not doing what people think it is doing? And so that's where it gets a little frustrating to me, because I think that a lot of people can come together and say that they agree on a lot of the things that they'd like to see, the reduction of violence, the reduction of suicide by firearm. But I think we need to create a better dialogue and a more informed dialogue on how it is that we get there, rather than throwing out a splashy marketing term and hoping at some point on the back end we achieve what it is we think we're achieving.
Yeah. I mean, I appreciate that, because you're an academic and you're just trying to get at, finding the commonality of a definition. And
Yeah.
and I'm a politician. I hate to say I'm a politician, but what happens is everybody's trying to. I mean, Frederick Hayek said the first thing that goes in any kind of tyranny or politicization is the language. I mean, terms get used and abused and bastardized to mean what one side or the other might mean. So I appreciate what you're saying. Are there any myths, though, out there with regard to the term ghost guns, or what are being referred to as ghost guns? Anything out there that's kind of odd or untrue, or just kind of urban legend on ghost guns?
Well, there's a lot. Some of it within my expertise and some of it not. But, for me, I think the fundamental misunderstanding around the term ghost gun is that it means a certain level and degree of what is a privately made firearm. And one of the things, a lot of times we get this perception that these things are new technologies, these are new concepts. And what I think I would, what I want people to understand is the idea of making a firearm as an individual person obviously dates back centuries, because before we had major manufacturing facilities, the people who made guns were individuals. And actually at the time, in the colonial period, there were about, I think, an estimated 2,000 to 3,000 gun makers in the colonies alone. And while there were, a few armories in different parts of the world, for the most part, a lot of those guns were made by people. And so those people were making, sporting arms, they were making military arms. And so we really relied on the private gunsmith. But then at the same time, what I don't think a lot of people realize is that not everybody was really good at it. Not everybody was making everything from scratch. So it's just not, that's just not possible, especially when you think about going into the American Revolution. I mean, you have to kind of scrap together what you can. And so in the colonies, people ordered parts kits from overseas, where basically they could assemble lock plates, triggers, stocks. And obviously there was a lot of modification that went into making that, but they were able to actually buy the bare bones to use to make firearms for a range of different purposes. So that one I think is the most interesting to me when I actually got into the study of privately made firearms, is the fact that, this idea that we would have some kind of component and then there'd be some level of, talent that would go into the creation of that, is something that's, pre the ratification of the Second Amendment.
Yeah, I mean, that is fascinating, because I'm not sure I've ever thought about that. Is how were the colonists, for instance, getting their guns? I mean, just you go down to the gunsmithy, I suppose, and say, look, I need a gun, and what do you want it to do? Well, I want to shoot game. I've got to feed my family or whatever. That's fascinating stuff, and I guess that's why you got involved in it.
Yeah.
Well, okay, let's talk more broadly, though, about modern America. So I think more than 20 million guns were purchased in this country in 2021. I think that's the number. I'm going to look real. Yeah. So yeah, it's 20 million.
That's a little bit too modern history for me.
Yeah, that's to me that's amazing. And so there is a surge going on, and there's also a surge, I think, of private kit builders. That's out there. There seems to be, at least from talking to people in Congress that I've come and encountered. What is the ATF doing, if anything? I mean, this may be out of your expertise. I don't know. What is ATF doing today that may be different with regard to watching over regulating private in-home gun kit putter-togethers? I mean, making up my own language here, but they're making their own guns, putting their own guns together. What do you know what's going on there?
No, just because I have not read the recent, the most recent kind of terminology that was put out there by the ATF, because that's not, my specialty. But I do know colleagues of mine who are specifically, looking at the different levels of building that's required, the way that they're defining the terms. I know how they were defining them back when I was, doing my initial research on it. But I do know that when it comes to defining these terms for anyone, it's incredibly difficult and almost virtually impossible to be able to encompass everything that you could possibly want when you're trying to define certain things, especially when it comes to regulation.
Yeah, I mean, so we recently did legislation where my colleagues across the aisle passed something, and they had assault weapons. And I mean, it was page after page after page, this gun, where they went through and they were trying to list every gun that they thought was qualify for regulation as an assault weapon, which I thought was interesting, because it gets to the point you were making earlier, is how do you define that, and how do you define these things, and so.
Well, in that's interesting, because I do know, one of the ways that was in the state of California that was used to kind of qualify what, an assault weapon was within their legislation initially was the listing of specific types of firearms. The problem with that, though, is then other guns are made. And it's the same thing with the California handgun roster. As other guns are made, how do you kind of keep up with that? And at least in California, and I know other states, but I can only really speak to what I know within what I did with the state of California, is that, they switched over to trying to describe features and types. Right. And basically, for a lot of that, there's so many different things in there, but semi-automatic and center fire are the two terms that people really, that hone in on when they come, into the conversation about the quote unquote assault weapons, assault rifles in 1950s term, assault weapons bans. And so then they go, okay, so it's semi-automatic and it's center fire, but it's not all semi-automatics, not all center fires. So how do we then delineate what it is that we are trying to regulate? And so that's where they start having conversations about capacity, pistol grips, folding stocks, but it all kind of gets very, it gets very in the weeds. The definitions get very, very specific, and then those, because they are so specific, then something else gets developed that's different, then they have to add that, and so it's almost like a vicious cycle that you see with each of these laws, and that's just one example.
Yeah, and so this thing that's been going on in my head since you and I started talking earlier is the assault weapon definition. I mean, because when you say semi-automatic, now you have to move from assault weapon down to semi-automatic, because they're going to say semi-automatic. But not all semi-automatics are going to qualify in their minds as assault weapons. And so how do you define semi-automatic?
Well, semi-automatic is probably pretty simple. I say that now, I'm like,
I mean, it sounds like it should be, right?
But basically, and that is actually, you make a good point, because one of the things too that goes under the assault weapons bans is a lot of the states change the definition of a machine gun as well within that particular ban to include semi-automatics, even though federally, it's automatic. So you've got two features that often get discussed together, because they were invented together, but they're very different. So automatic technology dates to the 1880s, as does semi-automatic technology. And automatic technology at its very basic level is essentially every time you press a trigger, the firearm fires rounds of ammunition until it runs out of ammo, which happens a lot, especially in earlier stuff. It malfunctions, or you release the trigger. A semi-automatic, which is also called self-loading at the time that it was invented, is basically every time you press the trigger, one round is fired, and then another round is chambered, and then when you press the trigger again, another round is fired. So those were invented around the same time, which is why the terms are pretty close together, but they are very different technologies. And so from my understanding, at least of what I've seen, the term semi-automatic tends to stay relatively similar and the same across the board. Automatic tends to stay the same across the board. But then when you come to terms like machine gun, where automatic is kind of like a sub definition, right. I do know that actually kind of surprised me when I was doing my research, that some states define that differently within that law specifically, even though that's not the historical and federal understood definition. It's really complicated, but fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, so that's why I raised it, is because I think almost all of us have have the same idea of what an automatic weapon is and a semi-automatic weapon. But when you start breaking it down because you want to regulate it, it becomes really complex, because you not just those terms. I'm talking in a broader scheme of things. It becomes complex because there are so many components. So many aspects, or you use term features that people think, well, that's dangerous. Maybe we need to regulate that. Maybe not. It becomes really hard in so many ways to regulate that stuff, and that's why you have experts like yourself who end up testifying before government and in lawsuits.
Well, and one of the things too that like I said, I'm not political one way or the other, and I have friends from a range of perspectives on firearms, and I talk with my friends who don't like firearms, and we have the conversation about if you want to reduce violence, which I think everybody wants to reduce violence, then we want to find the best channels in order to do that. And if they see an assault weapons ban as being that kind of vehicle in order to reduce violence in the country, then they should know all of the different details that go into it. And then they should, fight to have those details make sense and really help impact. Because if you're going to create the law and you believe in the law, then we need to make sure that the actual fine print of the law says what it is that that you're saying it's doing. And so my friends, come to me a lot about that when we talk about these specific restrictions, which is that if you believe in it, then let's actually implement it to the way that you see that definition. In reality, everyone should be pissed because, it doesn't do what it says it's doing. So how do we know if that's what works? It's quite complicated.
Well, so as we're about out of time, I'll just say it's good to hear somebody advocating for legislating not through ignorance, not through emotion, but through understanding and basically getting to the roots of it, and just knowing what you're going to do, what it means. Because I can tell you, so much of legislation, whether it's gun legislation or anything else in Congress, is based on a visceral interpretation of a situation. So it's fun to hear you advocate and say, look, let's at least find out what all this stuff means. Let's get the definitions right. It's a technical thing, something that an academic would say, maybe a historian in particular might say is necessary, but very few politicians that say that's necessary, unfortunately.
And I'm not a politician.
You're not a politician.
I'll leave that to other people.
Well, Ashley, thanks so much for joining me today. Again, if you want to follow Ashley, she doesn't get on her Twitter.
Oh, Twitter's toxic. I want nothing to do with it. But my Instagram and my Facebook.
Go to Instagram at History in Heels. You can go to my social media, which is Twitter at RepAndyBiggsAZ, and don't read the comments because they're toxic. Instagram at RepAndyBiggs, Facebook Congressman Andy Biggs, Truth at RepAndyBiggsAZ, or my site www.biggs.house.gov. You can see this on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts at What's the Big's Idea. Ask everybody to take a look at the documentary my office put out called Alien Invasion. You can get that at our website or any of the social media sites. I wish we had more time to talk to Ashley, and I'm going to say it again, Hlebinsky.
Hlebinsky, you had it right the first time, and then it went.
Yeah, it kind of kept going. The tongue got tied as we went along. But thanks again, Ashley, for being with me. Thanks everybody for watching, and join us next time on What's the Big's Idea.
Thanks.